Apparently, you guys really like it when I talk about rumors and theories and stories and ooh, spooky stuff, which may or may not be true, which is annoying because generally I stick to facts around here, but the idea of a rumored lost locomotive definitely piques the imagination, and some of these stories are often based on truth. So, today, I will take you to the great state of Mitten and Dog, Michigan. And yes, we have been here before, but this time the locomotive is not trapped within one of the Great Lakes. No, this time it's a logging locomotive, and the story doesn't give me a number to work with, though it is suspected, at least based off of one of the few articles I found about it, that it might be a climax. This legend takes us to Sheboygan, Michigan, near Alpena State Road, and the tale's been passed down through writings for over 100 years, and it centers around the operations of one Millard D. Olds, who was a prominent lumber baron in the area. He owned a lot of land east of Sheboygan, in and around what is now US 23, as well as Alpena State Road. That land is known to be fairly marshy, which I think you can see where this is going. But Old still pushed to build short-line railroads for getting the lumber out of the area, which was fairly common practice at the time. Trains were essential for the lumber industry, as were many geared steam locomotives. His particular line ran from his mill and out to his lands. The other individual involved in this particular story was a man named Charles Martineau. He was an employee under Olds, and was an engineer that worked on the locomotive. Now, for reasons that are not clear, Martineau was getting just a little bit fed up with Olds. Just a tinge, just a smidgen annoyed with his boss. And we've all been there. But Martineau's reaction was maybe a little bit extra to whatever Olds was doing, because he opted to drive his locomotive off the end of the line and directly into the swamp. Locomotives are heavy, and swamps are soft and wet and sticky. And as such, they couldn't actually get the locomotive back out again. And presumably Martineau was indeed fired for this little stunt, though the story does not make that very clear. She would sink further into the marsh over the years, and the foliage would grow up around her, making it so that her remains were actually pretty difficult to see. But over the years, a lot of locals who would walk through the area claimed to have spotted her, and such stories of abandoned or lost locomotives aren't unheard of in old lumber communities. Sometimes they're just stories, but sometimes they're true, and there have been times where locomotives have been stuck in the marshes and could not be retrieved, so they were just left. Verified accounts do exist, but in this instance, there isn't a lot of direct evidence to go off of. What is known is that Olds did exist and did do lumber business in the area, and Martineau was actually an employee of his. So all that is correct. Additionally, Olds did have two Climax locomotives, and one of them, presumably the lost locomotive's sister, is actually still in running condition, located at the British Columbia Forest Discover Center in Duncan, British Columbia. But in terms of the lost sister we have here, her location remains unknown, or even if she was ever lost at all, because there's a few possibilities here. Let's say, hypothetically, it's all true. Just for the sake of the argument, we're gonna assume everything about this is true. 100%. No question. No one embellished anything. Well, the thing is, there have been organized efforts to locate her exact position. The Department of Natural Resources, as well as hobbyists and regular historians, have all looked for her and failed. So, what the heck? Where is she? Where is she? Where is the locomotive? I want that steam engine! Well, there is a possibility here that she may have been salvaged a long time ago, because there were pretty intensive scrap metal drives during World War II due to the need for extra materials. And if someone knew that there was just an abandoned locomotive out there with precious metal in it, they could have just gone out and ripped her apart. So she may be long gone. But that's just a theory. The other possibility is, of course, that this is all bogus, and there was never a locomotive lost in the area at all. Because here's the other issue. Olds left behind records of his business and personal dealings, very detailed records, and historians have gone through them. He makes no mention of ever losing a locomotive in this manner. So, if he didn't say he didn't make a note of it, like if it were me, I'd personally make a mention in my journal or something. Like, oh my god, my employee went absolutely insane and wrecked one of my engines and now she's stuck in the bog. Like, something. Any kind of mention. But Old never did. Then again, one could argue that perhaps the whole incident was embarrassing for him and didn't want to mention it. There's a lot of hearsay and maybes, and I hate maybes. I hate maybes so much when it comes to these kinds of stories. And since the tale of the locomotive doesn't come with, like, a number, that bothers me. I do personally wonder if anyone who's gone looking for this locomotive has ever thought to bring a magnometer or a ground penetrating radar, because it shouldn't be too hard to determine exactly where she should be on the basis of where the track used to be. If the story is true and she was run off the end of the line, climaxes are not very fast. She didn't go sailing off the end of that track, okay? So you look where the line ended and just say, alright, she must be here. Get out the magnometer. Oh, there's no metal here. Oh. Well, time to go home. Like, it shouldn't be that hard. But the story still persists and remains a local legend. Whether or not there is a lost locomotive out there remains to be seen. But, like with all of these rumored lost locomotive stories, I have no issue with just checking. You know, just to see if there's something there, just to see if there might be a lost locomotive buried in the ground, in the swamp. And if she is there, well, I mean, then we can talk about getting her out. I don't know how we go about doing that, because swamp, I don't know if the area is still that swampy, though it probably is, and that would be a problem. That would make things a lot more difficult. Plus, how good a shape would she be in? I mean, probably in a lot better shape than most would think. And it would be nice to get her out, because climaxes are pretty unusual in the modern day. She'd be unique. I'm sure at the very least the locals would like to have her as some kind of display piece. But, she would have to actually exist. And I'm not 100% confident in that idea, personally. Again, not against checking, but I don't have a lot of faith that any of this is true, purely because of the scant details that I am able to come up with. But like all lost locomotive stories that I don't necessarily have a lot of confidence in, I kinda hope I'm wrong, you know? It'd be nice that she'd be there. I just don't think she is. But let me know what you think in the comments down below. Oh boy, since the last time I talked about rumors and stories did really well, I got another tale of a buried locomotive that I will admit, prefacing this with the fact that I actually think this is a lot more believable, but we'll get to why. This story takes us to Illinois, in the railroad territory now belonging to BNSF, though it once belonged to Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, which is the locomotive we're talking about. And by that I mean I have no earthly clue, because no one seems to, what locomotive this could possibly be, though, given the time frame, I think it's worth guessing it was probably an American. But in terms of number, in terms of exact model, you got me. Because no one knows. This story dates back over 100 years, and it's said there's a locomotive somewhere between Western Springs and Hinsdale, Illinois. According to at least one article I read about this particular subject, the legend always seems to crop up every time there's construction, most recently during the road work involving the Tri-State Tollway, or I-294, which actually required BNSF to construct a temporary bridge over the interstate. But back when the line was originally constructed, well, it's an old line. It dates back to the early 1860s. And that area was known to be ridiculously obnoxious to complete, because particularly next to what's known as Flag Creek, it was still fairly remote and really marshy, really wet annoyingly, obnoxiously wet, and annual reports of the Burlington route do show that for at least 2 years, mass amounts of fill soil had to be dumped in order to make the ground solid enough for them to actually build a line on it. But this took forever. Those marshy wetlands did not want to be built on, so it took a tremendous amount of effort, especially with technology back then, to actually make it happen, though it did happen. Not without loss, allegedly. Now, there are actually 2 different versions of the story of how this locomotive would have gotten there. One involves construction that took place during the 1860s. A work train actually overturned as a result of heavy rains that had actually shifted the roadbed. Instead of riding the locomotive, since they were trying to fill the area, they just used the locomotive as fill and rebuilt the track right over her. But historian Charlie Vick, and I mean like actual licensed went-to-school historian, not me, I read too much and post on YouTube historian, well, he says that this is probably an exaggeration of what likely was an engine or cars that sunk into muck and had to be pulled out. His point rests on the idea that the railroad at the time wouldn't have been able to spare any locomotive for this sort of waste. For one thing, it was during the Civil War, and war traffic was very heavy, and new locomotives were hard to get a hold of. And I would agree with Vic on this. That does seem right. If she just turned over, there's no reason why they would have just thrown her out at that point, when they would have needed every locomotive that they could possibly get. But, as I said, there is a second tale about this particular engine. This one comes from the 1890s. And the engine is said to be wood-burning, and she was passing through Western Springs headed for Hinsdale. She was pulling 2 cars and a caboose. The area was still very marshy, and the tracks represented pretty much the only piece of solid land that was west of the village. But supposedly, like the first story, the roadbed gave way, and she overturned. And because of how marshy the area was, she got stuck in the mud. Due to heavy rains and the surrounding water, they couldn't actually get her back out of the muck, so they salvaged whatever parts they could, and then just let her stay there, eventually sinking into the marsh entirely. Now this story I actually find a lot more believable because that exact thing has happened before. Particularly up in Canada. There are plenty of different stories that I could cite about locomotives getting stuck and them just not being able to get them back out again. So the idea of that happening in general is actually completely believable. But there's a lot of problems with the story too, in that, well, there's just not that many details. This is yet another word-of-mouth urban legend, and while it stayed circulating in the area all this time, and is probably based on something true, it's hard to say how true the story is anymore. A locomotive probably did derail in that area at one point or another, probably more than once. But did one actually sink and was left? That part is hard to say. And we wouldn't even be sure exactly where to start looking. I mean, we have the general area of the accident, but it's still a lot of ground to cover even with a magnometer, and then what exactly would we be looking for? Like I said, we don't know what kind of locomotive it was, but if she was wood-burning and given the era, as I said before, probably a 440 American. That's the best guess, and I only say that because of how common those were. But if that is the case, then she probably had a wooden cab, meaning that's gone. But a lot of people said in my last video about this that there's no point in digging up these buried locomotives because they've rusted away and are gone now. But you'd be surprised how well they can hold up. There's been plenty of cases of very, very violently old locomotives being taken out of the ground and still being relatively intact. I mean, they probably wouldn't ever run again, but you could still put them in a museum. So, finding this particular engine, which is known as the Little Lost Train, which, adorable and sweet, it makes me feel really sad actually, might be worth it, but it all depends on what model it is. Is she that unique? Would she be one of a kind? I mean, she's obviously not the only 440, but what kind of 440? Do you see how difficult it can be to figure this out when there's just no details to work with here? Plus, let's say this is a best case scenario and this is all true, and there is a locomotive buried somewhere in that area. Okay. Let's say we find her. How are we gonna get her out? They couldn't get her out when she was still near the surface. She's sunk in mud. Is she still lodged in there? I mean, we have modern equipment, but this is still going to be an expensive thing to do. It's not like we can take a dozen guys with a bunch of shovels and dig her out of there. I mean, I guess you could with a lot of nerve, but that's not a reasonable course of action. And like I said, this always gets cropped up whenever there's construction in the area because the area has been a lot more built up. What if you find her and she's underneath the highway? Or what if the first story is miraculously true and she's underneath the main line? I promise you, BNSF will not let you tear up their tracks to do this. That won't happen. Nor will the Illinois government let you mess with the highway to do this. Really anything, so we would have to get lucky and find her basically in the middle of nowhere. But even if we did, it would be a pain in the butt to get her out. I think it's worth looking into, but I don't have a lot of faith in ever finding anything. There'd be a lot of ground to cover, and, like, yeah, we could use a magnometer and be like, oh, we found some metal in the ground. But given the scope, that could be literally anything. Without any more details, or perhaps doing a deep dive into the records of Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, we might never know for sure, because this is all based on an urban legend. But maybe there is a record of them losing a locomotive around that time. And if there is, well, it probably tells you exactly where to look, and that would make it a lot easier. There's more paperwork and reading to do before anyone goes out there with a magnometer, is what I'm trying to say. I mean, if you've got the time, then by all means have at it. But this is yet another one of those legends that I hope is true, but at the same time, even if it is, I don't know if we'd ever be able to get her out. She sank in a marsh, and that makes this a lot more difficult. Plus, any kind of big excavation project could make what was a pretty unstable area unstable again. And yeah, I just can't see anyone involved being happy with that. To retrieve what would be an intact locomotive to a degree, I would guess, but not one in the best of condition. She gonna be rusty. She gonna be a rusty girl. But she's little and lost, and it makes me sad. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. Oh my goodness, you guys. You want to hear about the fact? The definite, real, I promise you total, 100% fact, that there is a J1A Pennsylvania Railroad steam locomotive that was buried underground. For real. I promise. Yeah, we're dealing with another locomotive that found its way to a really odd location, but, in this particular case, not only do I not have a lot of confidence in this particular theory, but also it is based purely on conjecture and hearsay and a whole bunch of what I would argue to be coincidences that ultimately amounts to no, this honestly makes no sense when you think about it. But I have been approached for this particular story multiple times, and recently I even got a actually very well thought out email from a follower, thanks Drew, who gave me a whole bunch of information about this. And I understand people like the mysterious stories, the definitely real, possible, oh my goodness, conspiracy theories around here, even though I try to stick to facts, but there are a bunch of facts that are in this tale intermixed with ridiculous conjecture, but let's talk about it. We're talking about Pennsylvania Railroad, specifically Pennsy 6435, who was a Class J1A. The J1s as a whole were 210-4 Texas types that were built between 1942 and 1944. They were very powerful locomotives, capable of delivering 94,000 pounds of force in tractive effort, plus an additional 15,000 pounds of force if they used their attached booster engines. They were big, impressive, and exactly what the Pennsy needed at the time. During World War II, the locomotives they had just really weren't cutting it, particularly for heavy freight trains. And as a result, they actually borrowed two locomotives, a 2664 Class A from Norfolk and Western, and a Texas from Chesapeake and Ohio. The Pennsy actually really liked the Texas, so they produced their own versions of that one, resulting in the J1 and eventually the J1As. A total of 125 were built at Pensy's own shops in Juniata, Pennsylvania, and they were one of many locomotives to be nicknamed War Babies as, well, that's when they were built. But they would remain in service not that much longer after World War II was over, as by the 1950s, Pennsylvania Railroad was starting to dieselize, and they would scrap a whole bunch of their steam locomotives. In fact, they were almost as bad as New York Central in this department. Very few original Pennsy locomotives were held for preservation. A lot of their classes were rendered extinct, and that included the J1s. Except, maybe not. See, the Pennsylvania Railroad, like many, kept pretty good track of the disposition of their engines. And for some weird reason, 6435 in particular, one of the J1As, as I said, is absent from the list of scrapped engines. This simple omission has spiraled out of control into some outrageous theories, but the one that's been settled upon is that 6435 wasn't scrapped, she was buried. Which, okay, it wouldn't be the first time a locomotive was buried in the ground, but the context here is important. See, the reason why 6435 is believed to have been buried, specifically at Pensy's Pitcairn Yard, is because it's thought that at least one employee had a soft spot for the locomotives and wanted to try to save one. So, he took it upon himself to bury this engine in the ground, in the hopes that she'd be discovered later. Now already I got so many problems with this, but we'll get to that in a second. The theory goes that the spot where the engine would have been buried is now covered by Norfolk Southern's main line, as well as a road bridge. And to date, the earth there hasn't been directly disturbed, nor has anyone checked to see if there's something large and metal buried just underneath the ground. That's the story. That someone took it upon themselves, instead of sending 6435 for scrapping, just buried her in the ground. And, you know, I understand that we as preservationists are very, very, very desperate to try to save as many of these historical engines as possible, especially one that would be one of a kind. But I gotta be honest, guys, like I said when I started this, I have no faith in this story because it's just that, a story, a tale that was spun over the years, because there are so many holes that can be poked in it that you might as well go out and get yourself some Swiss cheese, which at least that would taste pretty good. I like Swiss cheese. For one thing, okay, so we have a Texas here, a 210-4 steam locomotive, not a small engine by any stretch of the imagination, and one guy, one dude, said, I'm gonna bury this thing. How? When would he possibly have done that? And you mean to tell me no one knew that he had done this? No one suspected. So, alright, from the get-go, it would be nearly impossible for a single man to accomplish this feat without being noticed. Therefore, more than one person was definitely involved, and the more people you add in any kind of silent conspiracy, the more mouths there are to keep shut. And are you telling me that not a single one of these guys who knew that this had happened has said anything since that time? No one. Not a single soul has mentioned it. Even after Pennsy went under, and after they merged with New York Central, became Penn Central, and completely exploded, like, no one said anything even after that about this engine that was still there? And if 6435 wasn't scrapped, you mean to tell me that Pennsy just ignored the fact that they had never received the scrap value for that particular engine? You mean to tell me that they would have just not actually bothered to check to see where that money had gone off to, why they had never received it, why this engine wasn't marked down for scrapping? Oh, no, they probably did, and probably realized what I am about to tell you. This is a simple clerical error. They happen. Even in the most meticulously crafted archives from any company, there's gonna be a mistake. So it's likely, far more than her being buried, that her scrapping simply wasn't written down. Because the act of burying her, getting a whole bunch of people involved to accomplish that feat, and then just not saying anything about it, like why? Why wouldn't you say anything about that years after the fact? You think Pennsy employees are specifically staffed by the Pirates of the Caribbean? Like, come on now, this is ridiculous. You have to consider how difficult it would be to bury something as large as 6435 and then hide it from a company that was desperate for money at the time? Listen, but the story has attracted much attention over the years, to the point that people online even claim it is absolute fact, when, I promise you, it probably isn't. This is probably just a concocted tale that's been passed down and recirculated over the years, to the point that it's probably not even recognizable as the original rumor. One person says this engine was left out of the archives, another person says this engine must still be around, and the next person says she's buried and it must be here, even though there's absolutely no verifiable evidence of that being true at all. And as recently as 2017, there was even a Facebook group that was trying to get permission to go down to the area she allegedly is in and look over it, possibly with a magnometer, to see if there's any evidence that she's actually there. And I'll be real here, I wouldn't mind that. I would not mind someone taking a magnometer to the area with permission and just checking. Because there is also the possibility, as ridiculous as I think this story is, that I could be wrong. Because I don't have any evidence to prove that she was scrapped either. And that's kind of the difficulty when it comes to 6435. Because of what I believe to be a clerical error, we have no evidence either way. She's stuck in a perpetual state of limbo, historically speaking. She is a Schrodinger's cat of a locomotive, neither dead nor alive, trapped in this remarkable concept of, was she scrapped? We don't actually know that. Is she buried there? Probably not. But maybe, and it's the maybe that gets people. It's what gets the imagination running. It's why we get ridiculous tales like this. And again, just because I don't believe it, doesn't mean I'm gonna suggest that it not be looked into. I do think it is worth it, at least for a day trip, to go down and check it with a magnometer, see if there's something large, metal, possibly locomotive-shaped in that area. Because if there's nothing, then there's nothing. Great. I was right. Woohoo. Let's go home and mourn the fact that the J1s are truly extinct. But there might be something. And if there's something, well, that sort of changes the discussion a little bit. Because then we have to bring up the point of, okay, can we get permission to actually excavate the area? Can we possibly look to see if she's actually there, if that's actually her? And if so, can we get her out and put her in a museum? I mean, it's hard to say what condition she would be in after all this time, but I do think it would be remarkably foolish of me to suggest not checking it out, given how relatively simple it would be to do so. We wouldn't be jumping to a big-time excavation project until we do a cursory examination with a magnometer anyway. That part is relatively easy, and it is one of those situations where, yeah, I don't think she's there, but quietly, in the back of my mind, I kinda hope I'm wrong. It would be nice to be wrong in this case, because that means there's one more J1A that still exists and could be held for posterity. I don't think so, but it would be nice, so we'll have to see what happens. Probably nothing, since the Facebook group seems to have died when it comes to any and all interest in possibly looking into this, and I don't think anyone else has taken this story seriously since then, probably because it is legitimately ridiculous. But maybe some of you out there will get your imaginative gears working, and will get permission at some point to actually walk down there, take a look-see, and prove that I'm right, or I'm wrong. There's really only two options here. We are talking about the Cobble Hill Tunnel, also known as the Atlantic Avenue Tunnel, and the locomotive rumored to be hiding within. Also, it's worth noting the tunnel is located right underneath Brooklyn, New York City. Yes, really. The Cobble Hill Tunnel, or the Atlantic Avenue Tunnel, was originally built in 1844 as an open cut, which is kind of like a half tunnel. It's basically a tunnel without a roof. It was eventually roofed over into, well, a tunnel. It was utilized by the Brooklyn and Jamaica Railroad, so they could use it to transport people to the South Ferry over to Manhattan. The tunnel was a solid piece of work for its day, and it's actually the oldest railway tunnel beneath a city street in North America that was fully devoted to rail. There are a few older tunnels that had both rail lines and other vehicles or people in them, but this one was specifically for a rail line. Additionally, it's considered the oldest subway tunnel by the Guinness Book of World Records, although that's a little debatable as there are other examples of similar tunnels having been a few years older, but either way, it's old. Very old. But why would there be a locomotive inside it? Well, that's because the tunnel was closed in 1861. What happened was the New York State legislature voted to ban railroad locomotives from within the limits of the city of Brooklyn. Why would they want to do this? But the actual reason may have been down to corruption, believe it or not. The New York State governor was one John A. King, and he was a major shareholder in the Brooklyn Jamaica Railroad, later known as the Long Island Railroad. Because they were closing the line down, in the interest of fairness, a tax assessment was ordered on all property owners along Atlantic Street in order to defray the cost of the closure. The railroad, naturally, benefited from this, so there's the theory that they may have wanted to close the line anyway because it wasn't profitable enough, but also wanted that sweet tax assessment money. There's no proof of this, but regardless, the tunnel was closed, and it was pretty much forgotten, and fell into stories of legend and rumor. During World War I, some people started saying that German spies were using the tunnel to make bombs, and the Bureau of Investigation even broke through the roof of the tunnel with jackhammers to check. They found nothing, installed an electric light, and resealed it. In the 1920s, during Prohibition, it was rumored the tunnel was being used to make bootleg whiskey. There was no evidence of this, and no one ever went to check. In 1936, the New York City Police Department tried to enter the tunnel because they thought a body of a hoodlum might be inside. They did not gain access to the tunnel. In 1941, another rumor said it was inspected by the Works Progress Administration to determine its structural strength, which actually seems logical because it is sitting under a major part of the city. You'd want to make sure that tunnel wasn't going to collapse at any point, but there's actually no evidence that ever occurred. A few years after that, it was rumored to be reopened again, this time by the FBI, looking for spies. But there's no evidence of that happening. And more relevantly, and more factually, in the 1950s, it was sought by two rail historians, George Horn and Martin Schnachny, but they did not gain access to the tunnel. It was not until 1980, when a then 20-year-old Robert Diamond stumbled upon the remains of the tunnel. He entered in through a manhole he located at Atlantic Avenue and Court Street, and then crawled a distance of about 70 feet through a filled-in section that was less than 2 feet high. That's when he found the bulkhead wall that sealed off the main portion of the tunnel. He managed to convince a Brooklyn Union Gas Company engineering crew to help him break through the massive concrete bulkhead wall, which they found out was actually several feet thick. Past that, he gained access to the main portion of the tunnel, and then he began to popularize the tunnel as an antiquity. He hosted tours through it from 1982 until December 17th, 2010, which is where the locomotive comes in. Like I said, Robert was always hosting these tours through the tunnel, but it had always been kind of a shaky tour at best. There was no access to the tunnel from any means but that manhole, so every time he took people on a tour, they literally had to go down the manhole, which is a weird way to start a state-licensed tour, but he did it for a long time. They let him do it. That was until 2010, when the Department of Transportation, the DOT, terminated his contract and forbade him to re-enter the tunnel, citing safety concerns. Now, at face value, that makes a lot of sense, but that is until you bring into the equation the locomotive. Diamond believes wholeheartedly there is a locomotive down in that tunnel. It was left behind when the tunnel was filled in. The locomotive itself would have been built in the 1830s, and it appears to be a 220. It's small, but would have made sense for the time and the tunnel. Thing is, Roberts never actually found the locomotive down there. Even though he hosted the tours for over 2 decades, the locomotive itself is in a part of the tunnel that he has never been able to access, but through the use of a magnometer, he believes that he has found it right under Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn. Right about the time this was going on, Robert actually was in talks with National Geographic. Yes, the National Geographic, who wanted to film Robert and a team going down and finding the locomotive. This seems like something that National Geographic would be really gung-ho about, and they were. The problem was, during the process to get the permits in place to do something like this, and to investigate further into the tunnel, that is when the DOT decided to pull the rug out from under them.
The DOT said it was too dangerous and refused to allow Robert or Nat Geo to press on top of forbidding him to run his regular tours at all. While safety concerns are being cited, it's debatable how true this actually is. See, what happened was, between Robert and the National Geographic investigation team, they pretty much confirmed there's a locomotive there without actually finding it. But the magnometer confirms there's at least something large and metal down there. It being a locomotive is a pretty reasonable idea, and if it is, it's probably in incredibly good condition. Out of all the locomotives I discussed on this channel, this one is likely in the best shape overall. It isn't underwater, it isn't underground. Well, it is, but it's in a hollow area underground, in the open air, yet also out of the elements. It's covered. It's in one of the best positions you could possibly ask for to be preserved. It probably has suffered some rust and decay over the years from just sitting, sure, but in terms of historical objects and preservation, this one's condition is likely to be incredibly good. All of this I just told you leaked to the press. Apparently this really infuriated Seth Solomanow at the Department of Transportation, and that's when he shut down all access to the tunnel. There's a lot of grudges going on in this story. Apparently the Department of Transportation never actually liked Robert Diamond doing what he did. It's just there was nothing inherently illegal about it at the time, so they let him go. And according to National Geographic, Diamond is a little, well, odd. Eccentric might be the word. He clearly loves the tunnel, loves the history, and wants the locomotive to see the light of day, but the way he goes about it is a little erratic. Right now he's in the middle of suing National Geographic, which seems like the absolute wrong thing to do, but he suspects that they're the ones that caused the Department of Transportation to shut him down, which doesn't really seem to be the case. Why would Nat Geo intentionally cause access to a historical site like this to be shut down? On purpose. That makes no sense. I suspect what's going on here is a couple of things. For one thing, the DOT just doesn't like Robert Diamond. Robert Diamond doesn't like them, doesn't like being told what to do, and everyone's fighting over the situation. But if you notice, the DOT didn't get mad until they said they found the locomotive. And I think that's where the problem is. It's the locomotive itself. Not just the fact that it's there, but where it is exactly. See, here's what's going to happen. Let's say they did allow National Geographic and Diamond to go down and find this thing. Let's say they find it. They confirm it's there, sitting, in what I can guess would be in pretty good condition, all things considered. Now, what do you think they're going to want to do? They're not going to want to leave it there. Once they confirm this thing is there, people are going to want to get it out of there. This is a piece of history, of city history. There's going to be rail fans from all across the world clamoring to see this thing, wanting it to be removed from the tunnel and preserved. The problem the DOT would have then is the massive amount of headache it would take to deal with everyone clamoring to get the thing out of there. If they say no, everyone's going to be mad at them. They're already mad at them, but they'll be really mad at them if they don't let them get the locomotive out of there. But if they do, then they gotta deal with the idea of a main street in Brooklyn, New York, already a place that has a ton of traffic, being shut down while this locomotive is extracted from beneath it. You'd have to tear in through the street itself, navigate around water pipes and gas lines, and then lift it out of there. Oh, and put everything back the way you found it. Exactly. Such a process would, I would imagine, take at least a week, meaning they would have to shut down a street for a week to get a locomotive out of a long abandoned tunnel. I just don't think it's a headache the DOT wants to deal with at all, and I understand that, but they are denying the discovery of a major part of the city of New York's history. It's something relevant to that city's past, and depending on what kind of locomotive it is, it may be the only one left in existence and needs to be preserved in a museum somewhere. The whole thing comes across as incredibly frustrating, and all sides in the argument have valid points, but if you're asking my honest opinion on it, from the way it looks, it just seems like the Department of Transportation is being just a little corrupt because they don't want to address something that they could easily shut down. Which just comes across as cowardly if you ask me, but it happens. I don't know how much Robert Diamond has annoyed them over the years. Maybe he asked for it. I don't know the man myself. Like I said, Nat Geo finds him a little eccentric. But as it stands right now, access to the tunnel was cut off in 2011. And the DOT has not budged on the subject since. But hopefully, eventually, the DOT chooses to be a little lenient on the subject and allow at least an investigation. I'm not going to push hard for this locomotive to be taken out of the tunnel if it's going to be that much of a hassle. I understand that you have city infrastructure to worry about, you have people just living their lives around, and they don't want to be interrupted by extracting a locomotive from underground. Okay, I follow that logic. But also, you could at least let us see what's there. Like, it may not be anything. Maybe a big pile of metal for all we know. But I just want to know, is that a locomotive or isn't it? Just let us figure it out. That's all I'm saying.
And lastly, I'm also very sorry to say that as I was editing this video for upload, I learned that Robert Diamond had passed away within the last year. He died in his home back in August, without ever regaining access to his tunnel. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.